All righty. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, thank you for joining us there. Or if you're joining us on Zoom, welcome. My name is Ben Soniga, and I am excited to have you all here. And I'm excited to share with you more about our campaign and the launch of our new energy storage Save It for Later campaign. So again, my name is Ben Soniga, and I'm the Solar and Storage Campaigns Director with Environment America. I will like to say that before we get started with the agenda and the presentations, that there's going to be some time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions throughout any of the presentations, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom, or in the chat if you're on Facebook Live, and we'll be checking the chat there as well for questions. So go ahead, next slide, please. So again, just to give a quick introduction of our speakers, thank you all for being here today. Myself, I'm going to kick things off with an introduction of our Energy Storage Save It for Later campaign, including some of the findings of our most recent Renewables on the Rise report and policy recommendations. Then we'll hear from Carl Rabago with Local Solar for All, talking about the role of local solar and storage in the clean energy transition. Then we'll hear from Bridget Sanderson, who is the State Director of Environment Missouri, about solar and storage in that state. And last and certainly not least, we'll hear from Janelle Hazlett, who is a New Orleans resident, solar and storage owner, and in her own words, retired from oil and gas in 2020, congratulations, and a community activist since Katrina in 2005. And then we will have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So let's go on ahead. The first slide, please. So I'd like to introduce our new energy storage Save It for Later campaign by starting with the obvious question, why energy storage? So I think it's important to first say that the #1 thing driving this campaign from our perspective is the fact that clean and renewable energy is growing rapidly. America has nearly tripled the amount of wind power it produces since 2011. And also produces over 23 times as much solar power as we did in 2011, which is enough to power more than 12 million average American homes. So the transition to 100% renewable energy will mean growing key technologies like these, and it will also mean expanding our ability to be able to store that energy for later. So energy storage technologies like batteries are what can help us fully harness the power of renewable energy by storing it for later. Very simply, when the sun is shining during the day, that excess energy is going to be stored and used at night when we need it, or even supplied back to the grid during the day to help with peak demand. So having locally sited storage and renewables can even help create a more reliable grid in the face of a blackout or power outage, which we'll hear more about later today. And really, the more we're able to fully realize the potential of renewables by pairing them with storage, the faster we can realize a healthier and cleaner future and put fossil fuels in the past. So next slide, please. The good news is that storage is growing. It is according also to our recent report, Renewables on the Rise, that looked at battery storage data in the States over the last decade. The nation's battery storage capacity grew by more than 18-fold from 2011 to 2020, and grew by 67% in 2020 alone, which is that big green bar over to the right of your screen. Some of the states that have led the way over this time period have been California, Texas, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Hawaii, just to name the top 5 there. We have the top 10 listed on the screen. And although we have a long way to go for energy storage to catch up and be on pace with other renewables like rooftop solar, it's really exciting to see this trajectory, especially over the last year. We know that the technology is only getting better, and we're poised to keep accelerating the progress. So next slide, please. So we know that states can lead the way, in light of exciting upward trends and the knowledge that we need to keep accelerating over this next decade if we want to reach our renewable energy goals and build a cleaner and more resilient grid. So we have chosen at Environment America to call on states to make commitments to energy storage. The reason why we've chosen goal setting and to work in the states is because we know from our work that goal setting works. Over the last decade, 30 states have made commitments to require renewable energy. At first, requirements were small, but as renewables grew and goals were surpassed, states were empowered to think bigger. In 2018, California pledged to move to 100% renewable energy, and then in just 3 years, we now stand at 9 states committed to 100% renewable energy. So on the right, you can see states committed to 100% renewable energy currently in orange, and then the states with renewable energy requirements and those who have increased their goals and their requirements in the 2 colors of blue. Now on the left-hand side of the screen is a map of the states who have made some form of commitment to adding energy storage as a part of that plan and requirement. So while it's exciting that states are leading the way and that these states are taking action already, there's clearly lots of work to be done to fill in the gaps in order to make sure that clean energy storage is a part of every one of these renewable energy plans across the country. And we know that ambitious goal setting as a first step spurs forward a virtuous cycle of progress, as we've seen with solar energy and wind energy. And it's time to make sure that we're equally taking advantage of our ability to store that energy for later by making the same commitments to storage. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we think would make a strong commitment to energy storage, there's a few key things that we look for. The first is that there should be both short and long-term goals. This is true of goal setting in general and in life, but we know that setting ambitious long-term goals is important because we want to know where we end up and where we want to be in the long term, but making sure that interim goals and targets are set along the way ensures that you're not falling behind on your goal. Second thing is accountability. In some cases, this can mean a legal accountability, passing a legal mandate that holds the state accountable to reaching these goals, or it could just mean something like including penalties, maybe financial penalties for not hitting the goal by a certain time to incentivize that. Similarly, on the other side, a strong commitment can include financial incentives that will bring down the cost and make it more affordable for more people, thereby boosting the amount of storage. I'd add here that Environment America is also advocating currently at the federal level for a suite of clean energy tax incentives, including for solar and a new credit for standalone storage, which would of course be a game changer for boosting storage in the states and across the country. Fourth, transparency measures such as required annual reports on the state of storage help measure progress towards the goal and ensure that accountability that we want to see. And of course, last but not least, when states are considering making a commitment and setting a goal, it should be ambitious and they should match the level of renewable energy that we need to meet our clean energy goals in the states. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do about it in this campaign, with a clear list of benefits that come from expanding our ability to store clean energy and, the stage completely set for progress. I'm excited to be launching this campaign today and share that our goal is to convince 10 key states to set or increase existing targets for energy storage by the year 2025. The ways we'll go about doing that, just some of the ways listed here through public education, of course. First and foremost, as a grassroots organizing group, we need to make sure that the public knows why energy storage is a key component to a cleaner and healthier future. Report writing and fact sheets to continue tracking the progress of storage and the best policies to support it. Grassroots organizing to show a broad support for our solutions. Coalition building with key stakeholders, and finally working directly with elected officials to introduce and pass legislation. And I'll share that our initial set of targets in the states are in California, Texas, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Missouri. So with that, if you go to the next slide, you just have my contact information. And then with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carl Rabago from Local Solar for All to talk more about the specific role of distributed solar and storage.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be part of another great thing from Environment America. And I'm glad you're taking on this issue because it is absolutely essential that we develop energy storage, especially distributed energy storage, as a complement and as an enabler of a transition to 100% clean energy economy. What I want to do is set the stage by sharing some information coming from some of our work at the local Solar for All Coalition, in conjunction with Vibrant Clean Energy, a modeling firm based here in Boulder, Colorado, and tell you about how getting to that clean energy future means we need to really reach strong, aggressive goals for energy storage if we want to have a win-win-win situation. So I'm extracting for you here some of the information we've recently shared in relating to our modeling of getting to President Biden's 80% clean electricity by 2030 goal, with a goal of moving that forward to a vision of even more 100% clean electricity by the end of 2050. And in this modeling, storage stands out. So let's go to the next slide and talk about, right at the top, what did we find, right? So we did some modeling using a state-of-the-art modeling tool developed by Vibrant Clean Energy, what they call in the biz, a capacity expansion and production cost modeling exercise, basically a utility plan for the lower 48 states. And in achieving the goals that the president has set out, which are at the minimum necessary, I think, to be climate responsible, what we found in looking just to 2030, so just within the manageable next 8 years of time that we have to work in, we need to build out 103 gigawatts of distributed solar. And that distributed solar will be enabled, like I said, and complemented by 137 gigawatts of distributed storage capacity. And it's important to know that while we have both utility scale and distributed scale resources, the distributed scale resources are what bring the value and potential savings to the model. So they also enable the utility scale resources that are so also important for getting the entire grid to being zero carbon. The numbers for growing the utility scale resources are huge. There are also big numbers for utility scale storage. But if we pursue a distributed resource strategy that takes advantage of the benefits of distributed resources, which I'm going to show in just a second, we could save $100 billion in total electricity costs. And that's assuming that we all pay for everything. If we can continue to encourage customers to make private additional investments, whether they're individual customers or corporate customers, those savings could go up even more. If we pursue a distributed focused strategy that enables and takes advantage of distributed solar and storage, we can also add incrementally to the job growth in this country, which is another way in which this pays off. And distributed resources can be targeted to address the energy injustice and inequities that have so long plagued our system. We can make sure that everyone shares in a cleaner, more reliable, more resilient, more distributed energy system. What we found is not new. A lot of other people have found similar things, but we've put it together with a new model that really does bring together all these aspects of our findings, and that's what's pretty exciting. If you go to the next slide, I'll just show you what it looks like. Here's the big build out, right? If we build out distributed resources, we have to grow to that over 100 gigawatts level, and we have to take our small start, but good start in energy storage, distributed energy storage, and grow that dramatically as well. If you go to the next slide, you can see the shape of the payback. The shape of the payback is that we start saving money from day one, and we save all the way out to 2030 and keep saving all the way out to 2050 as well. I can't stress how, to so many people, this will be counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it just makes sense. Right-sizing your energy solutions, including both your generation sources like distributed solar and your storage resources like distributed storage, enables you to be much more efficient in designing the kind of system we need to meet energy demand. But there's more to it than even that. If you go to the next slide, what we see is that by right-sizing and adding resources that are small in scale, we can actually smooth the load that the entire utility system sees. In this graphic, we plotted on the top half of the graphic, the gray sidebar there, what the utility system has to do with its generation to change the many swings that normally come about in unmanaged demand. Basically, this adds huge costs because the generation system has to go chasing these changes in demand, and that puts wear and tear on the facilities. Go to the bottom half of this, optimize your distributed storage and solar capacities and capabilities. You smooth the shape of the load, you get more value out of your utility scale resources, and you make the total system cost less for everyone. In addition to smoothing the load, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we also have an amazing capability with storage to shape the load that the entire grid sees and to spread the savings, not just from the peak times that everybody is focusing on, but across 80% of the hours in the year. This graph, if you just go to the top of the colored area, you will see basically the shape of how the electric system has to operate. And what it really shows is that in, gosh, less than 10% of the time do we really fully use the system. Heck, less than 10% of the time do we even use 80% of the system we have to build because our system is what we call peaky. With distributed resources, we can shave that expensive peak, but because distributed storage and distributed solar operating in concert can change the shape of the overall load, we get savings across 80% of the hours in a year. That means it's not just a niche product, it's an everywhere, everything product. It's not an or product, it's an and product that makes the rest of the system work well as well too. What does this look like in terms of changing the way the system has to look? The next slide shows you the real differences are not that much. We modeled a world in which we stopped using distributed resources and just use large scale stuff because everybody keep telling us that, oh, only the large scale stuff is cost effective. And then we modeled this optimized distributed resource path, and that's the difference in the two side-by-side red circles here. By adding a good amount, a noticeable amount, but not an extreme amount of distributed resources, of diversity to our resource mix, we can achieve those massive savings and get a more resilient and reliable system. That's we don't have to tear down the entire grid to take advantage of storage. We just have to increase the use of the distributed scale resources. The next slide will show you that the payoff comes in terms of those incremental jobs. Distributed resources have more labor content, they're more job intensive. So we can add that 1.2 million incremental jobs just by 2030 if we pursue this strategy. Go to the next slide. And sorry, my dogs decided they don't want to be in the room anymore. I get a chance to say thank you for this brief overview. I want you to know that if you go to Local Solar for All, we've got more detailed information, narrative reports, studies from various states, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, Carl. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Bridget Sanderson, who's the State Director of Environment Missouri.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, Carl, actually, my dog started grumping behind me, so I was kind of worried he was going to make some noise. So as Ben said, I am Bridget Sanderson. I'm the Director of Environment Missouri, based out of Kansas City, Missouri. And today I'm going to be talking a lot about some of the work that we're doing in the state of Missouri, and also about grid resiliency and having power on in your house. So if you think back all the way to February of this year, there was a very large cold front that came through, and we had some extreme weather in the middle of the country. And if you remember, Texas was, of course, without power and heat when in frigid temperatures. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit and what happened there, and how energy storage, especially renewable energy storage, can actually help make that less of a problem when we have more and more extreme weather events due to climate change. And so I don't know if you can see this very well, but on this slide, I have on the left side of the screen, a Facebook post from a senator, a state senator in Kansas. I know I'm from Missouri, but Kansas is just on the other side of Kansas City's state line. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But this is a Kansas State Senator Mike Thompson, who was actually very quick on some misinformation about what was happening during that cold snap and why we were having power outages throughout Texas and throughout the Midwest. He was trying to blame that wind energy, the wind turbines were freezing up, and that's why we had these rolling blackouts in Kansas and Missouri. And Ben pointed out the renewables on the rise report. Kansas and Texas both kind of lead the way across the country in wind energy. And so, him stating that wind energy was the cause of all of this was actually pretty problematic. And so that's some of the work that we do, is try to combat some of that misinformation. And so we put out a statement to basically state, no, that's not actually what was going on. And then you can see in the middle of this slide, I have an article from the Missouri Independent that came out in about July. So Texas is in a different, regional power pool, basically. And so in Kansas and Missouri, we're in the Southwest Power Pool, the SPP. They came out with an investigation basically stating what happened and why in Missouri and Kansas we were having rolling blackouts as well. And so they stated, I had to write down some of these numbers so I remembered them, but and the Southwest Power Pool, of course, it covers power for 17 different states. It's essentially the middle of the country to Texas. And so they were stating that it was actually the fuel shortages of natural gas is the reason why we didn't have enough energy to keep power and heat on in people's houses during this extreme weather. They stated that about half of the projected megawatts from natural gas actually, weren't reliable sources of energy during such cold snap. And then coal generation was actually off by about 25%. However, wind, in which, Senator Mike Thompson had stated, was actually met the accredited capacity during a winter storm. Yes, some wind turbines went down, but it didn't affect the fact that we had rolling blackouts. And then I included a little blog post or a statement from our Environment Texas director, Luke Metzger, discussing that this problem was coming up again with more extreme weather, but on the opposite end, it was during a heat wave in Texas. And so, their utility companies were asking them to cut down on power because they thought that they were going to come up against the same issue. And so, again, we try to tackle misinformation. And so to not be on such a sad thing, we need to make our grid more resilient. And as Ben was stating earlier, of course, we want clean, renewable energy. And so, I'm so sorry. So, we've been promoting, of course, wind and solar energy generation in the state of Missouri. We do, as Ben was stating earlier, have a renewable energy standard that was actually a ballot initiative in Missouri in 2008 that stated that the state of Missouri had to get 15% of their energy from renewable energy sources by 2021, by this year. And so we know that Missourians overwhelmingly do support renewable energy generation. It passed pretty easily in 2008. So we are also currently in Missouri, currently updating our energy planning process with the Department of Natural Resources. And so we've had a bunch of stakeholders giving inputs about pushing for renewable energy generation and storage. And so on a high note, kind of to end on a high note about all of this stuff, that basically solar energy it's a lot more resilient essentially and effective because it is close to the source of use. So there's not the needs to basically have these large distribution and transmission lines that can get affected during extreme weather can actually stop energy from going through those transmission lines. And of course it's renewable, it's always there. So, we want to, of course, expand our solar storage. And then another highlight is that in Kansas City, Missouri, we are actually on the right side of this slide. This is a tweet from our city manager, Brian Platt. Kansas City is currently working to build looking to build one of the largest solar arrays in the United States. Right outside, we're getting a brand new airport terminal, so right outside of the airport terminal. And it's going to be about half the size, I think they say about 2,000 acres, half the size of Manhattan, which is huge. Of course, we're lucky and fortunate in Missouri to have that type of land space. And we love to see it being used for things like renewable energy generation. And it's going to provide about 300 megawatts of power. And so that actually, if all of this comes to fruition, we'll be able to power the entire city of Kansas City, Missouri, once that's actually up and running. So we're really looking forward to that. We, of course, want to state over and over again the importance of solar storage, especially with something at this scale, to make sure that we have power when it have extreme weather events. We want to have, ACs on when it's 100 degrees, and we want to have heat on when it's 0 degrees. So yeah, that's just a little bit about how solar storage can help with our resiliency and make our grid a more reliable grid. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Bridget. And then with that, I will turn it lastly over to Janelle Hazlett to talk a little bit more about your experience with solar and storage as an owner in New Orleans.
There we go. Speaking now, so I ended up on the news because of Environment America, talking specifically about the storage and my solar configuration on my house. And one of the questions you asked early on, you were starting the whole conversation, is why storage? For me, why storage was, my solar panels are great. They provide me with power and allow me to reduce my costs for energy. But without storage, when the grid is down, my solar panels are worthless. So I added the Tesla Powerwalls to the back of my house because I needed storage, because we have outages on any given Tuesday. We can have an outage, not for very long, but on any given Tuesday we can have an outage. And in the middle of the summer, when it's 90+ degrees, it's nice to keep the AC on, and the storage will allow me to do that. But we also didn't suffer when it was very cold in the winter. The storage carried us over the outages that we had during that winter storm, when Entergy actually shut off more power than they needed to because they had some of their emergency systems misconfigured. And it also let us roll through Ida. My neighbors have gas generators. It's a big deal. There's tax incentives. Go out and buy generators. Everybody goes out and buys a gas generator. And gas generators work. People are used to them. But the thing that happened with Ida is so many people were looking for gasoline that folks were having to drive to Mississippi to fill up the containers to be able to then put gas back into their generators. I didn't have to chase gas. I didn't have to worry about carbon monoxide. The storage is small and completely silent. Generators are terribly noisy when you have like 5 or 6 running in a small area. So the other thing that storage for me, why storage, is it allows me to further save, because whatever I have in the batteries in the evening reduces my pull from the grid at night. So it continues to cut my cost. And I was just looking at the app. Right now, I'm completely off grid. Of course, it's lovely. It's like, 75 degrees outside. It's completely sunny. And it's been nice. We haven't really had to use the air conditioning, which is allowing me to recharge my battery, run what I'm running off of the solar panels. And it allows me to continue to function. So, and there's a lot of misconceptions out there about solar panels. Lots of people were surprised. I have my solar panels. I'm off grid. Why am I not working? It doesn't work without the storage. So people make that's the misinformation, bad assumptions. And so one of the things that I think would help when you're looking to educate people or convince people what's in it for them is that that storage allows you to run when the grid is gone, and the grid is gone more often than we would like it to be. And I need the grid. I want the grid. I do not have enough capacity on my roof, nor with the power walls to provide the house the power that it needs. So I need and want the grid. I'm also very lucky in that my solar system allows me to reduce my costs in a way that other folks in Louisiana don't necessarily get to do, because we have a true net metering agreement with inside the city of New Orleans, such that it's a kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour exchange. If I give them one, then they subtract that from my bill. If I take one, it's the same cost. Whereas in the rest of Louisiana, it's not like that. You pay more to pull from the grid than you are paid when you put back on the grid. Let's see. I guess after that, for me, it's what questions would you have? Because a lot of what I hear from large organizations like you all is a push for people to understand, but it's way more complicated for your average individual to take that leap. It can be scary. It's a lot of money. Do I understand completely how it's going to work? Is it going to work the way I want it to? For me, it wasn't that scary because I was in the oil and gas industry. I understand how to run big projects. I could run through all of that. And even working in oil and gas, which is what allowed me to put the solar panels up in the first place, it took me a while. I put the panels up in 2012 and I didn't put the power walls in until the end of 2019. Some of that was waiting for costs to come down. Some of that is because the lots here in the city of New Orleans are incredibly small, and you can't have big storage banks for batteries if you're going to do it in an urban area like we're in. So I had to wait for the battery storage to be small enough to fit in my spaces. And there's so much opportunity to educate people so that they can begin to make these decisions for themselves and to stop being misled by utility companies and oil and gas that really don't want distributed generation and storage to happen. And I say that as someone who's on the inside.
Great. Well, I'll pause there. Thank you so much, Janelle. Thanks to our other speakers, Carl and Bridget. I will just pause and open it up for questions. I think we have a slide. Yep. So again, if you're on Facebook with us on Facebook Live, go ahead and use the chat function. If you are on Zoom with us, go ahead and use the Q&A function. I'm interested, Janelle, to hear a little bit more about you. You said you're a community activist since Katrina, recently retired from oil and gas. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, experience and why you say you're a community activist.
Oh, well, everybody knows in Katrina, New Orleans ended up flooded, right? And part of what was being pushed in the aftermath of Katrina was, well, we're just not going to build everything back. People are going to have to consolidate into smaller areas of the city. And there was this whole, here in the city of New Orleans, we call it the green dot episode, where there were literally green dots placed on neighborhoods which said, we're not going to worry about y'all unless you prove your viability, whatever that meant. And so we had a green dot pretty close to us. And there were lots of homeowners in the area who said, well, what does it mean to prove your viability? And what it really meant was to get together, say you were still here, and say that you were still deserving of city services. And I hadn't really been involved in speaking at a city level, like talking to my council or reaching out to people in our state legislature until Katrina. And then once I started doing that, folks don't let you stop. When an issue comes up and they have seen that you've been able to gather the information, find the right person to speak to, get people who are being impacted into the same room so they can talk about stuff, they don't let you stop. So folk will come to me about that. And as far as the solar is concerned, I've been banging the solar power drum for a really long time. I think that it's important for us to be able to take care of ourselves, right? I need the grid. I want the grid. My brother and his two sons are linemen for our local power company. So they provide jobs, all that's good, but under duress, like when it's really cold and the grid's not performing the way it should, or when you have things like Ida, hurricanes, weather like that happen, I don't need to be a burden on the system, right? They need to go take care of themselves. They need to go get the grid back up, and I need to be able to take care of myself because they don't have time to worry about everybody's fridge. And people buy generators here all the time. They have no issue at all chasing gas most of the time. And one of the things that was tested as a result of Hurricane Ida was a lot of folk were saying, well, I don't want to buy a gas generator. I'm going to buy an electric generator. And I'm going to get like, I think it's a Jackery is the one that became the model that lots of folk were looking into. I want to buy an electric generator such that I can charge it with solar panels so I don't have to chase gas or worry about carbon monoxide poisoning. And so there's a little group of folk who are testing the waters for that. The problem really is still that the infrastructure to allow individuals to do that is still too expensive for so many people. They just can't afford to do it without tax credits. And so that's the next thing to do here is to try and push for tax credits to come back to the state of Louisiana. They're gone. They used to be 50%. Up until 2012, the state would give you 50% back on whatever you spent on solar, and that included storage as well. But right now they're not at the state level, they're only at the federal level. And so I'm hoping that if we can get tax credits at the federal level, and then you get additional tax credits at the state level, you begin to put the infrastructure that needs to go on an individual's house within reach of more people.
I couldn't agree more. I think you just basically stated our campaign goals in order there. And actually somebody just asked how important are our financial incentives. I think you kind of answered that question.
They're absolutely critical. And the other thing is that when the legislation is written, the legislation needs to be carefully written, not to just include individual homeowners, but especially here in New Orleans, there are homeowners that own shotgun doubles, duplexes, right? And the current tax laws don't allow those individuals to qualify. They're living in their home, they're using the power in their home, but because that home has the capacity to have a renter in it, they don't get the credits. And a lot of older people here in the city of New Orleans actually have that set up and would benefit greatly, but the legislation isn't written to allow it. So the legislation has to be carefully crafted if you really want to benefit everybody.
Carl, did you have thoughts?
Sorry, yeah, that was all really great, Janelle. I was curious, you had stated we have net metering in Missouri, and it has been under attack, of course, that financial aspect of being able to sell over, the energy you're not using back into the grid. And I was curious, you said that it's in New Orleans. I'm curious if that's a statewide policy.
No. Entergy New Orleans, Entergy is our utility provider, right? There's Entergy Louisiana, Entergy Arkansas, Entergy Mississippi, and there's Entergy New Orleans. It's a separate entity. And that separate entity is governed by our city council. And the city council gets to make the rules about how the utility is regulated. And they put those incentives, the net metering incentives in place, and have been able to hold the line against our public service commissioners who, with the exception of one fellow, the public service commissioners who are trying to claw back net metering. Louisiana is a huge oil and gas state, and they truly believe, the politicians and many people truly believe that oil and gas, without oil and gas, there's nothing. And that's not the case, because oil and gas has been exiting Louisiana since the 80s. And if they were to watch closely, they can see that happen. And they keep thinking, if we give oil and gas more, if we give them more, then maybe they'll stay and maybe it'll be okay. It's not. Oil and gas knows that their time is limited, and they're leaving Louisiana. And so Louisiana needs to kind of learn not to kowtow, right? Not to give in to oil and gas, and not to give in to the utility companies who also actually make money by increasing their generation capacity, right? Because the way that our utility companies are regulated means that whatever it takes to give us power, they tally all that up and then they divide it and they say, okay, that's how much I'm going to charge you for your rate. And they can't really make a lot of money. They make some, but they can't make a lot of money distributing the energy. They make money generating the power. And the easy way, the ways that are in place already to generate the power are all or mostly petroleum based, right? Dirty fuel based. And it's a challenge for them to set up giant solar panels, and I mean giant fields of solar panels or wind or other green energy. And so not only does the legislature fight it, but the utility companies fight it as well, because that's where they make the bulk of their profits. They're allowed to make profits in generation, not in distribution.
Yeah. It's just so fascinating. I actually, total side point, used to be a geologist prior to Environment Missouri. And so you're just speaking, my love language.
Well, that's the other thing, is that geologists tend to think like systems, right? We think in whole systems. And so much of what I see people struggle with is trying to have that one thing be the one right answer. And in order to solve this, our energy generation, there's not one magic bullet. It's not a simple answer. You have to think about the whole picture. That's harder for your average Joe or Jane.
Right. Yeah. So I just wanted to add a note a little bit on Missouri's stuff. So Missouri is incredibly dependent. As I was saying, about our renewable energy standard is only 15% right now. And we're incredibly dependent on coal. I think it's been about 70% of our grid is dependent on coal. I think it's gone down a little bit, like maybe 65%. I have to look back at those numbers. But most of the coal that we're getting is actually from out of state. And so if we generated clean renewable energy in the state of Missouri, I just want to emphasize how much more reliable our state power grid would be. So I just wanted to add that. I felt like it kind of went along with what you're saying.
Yeah, generation close to the source of use is the way you are resilient. If what you need is too far away from you, bad weather is going to cause it to be potentially unavailable. So the closer your generation can be to the use as an individual, the better off you are. And my solar setup isn't perfect. When I was running after Ida, we ran fridges, fans, and when the sun was really high and we could see that we were making more energy than we needed, because the power walls are smart. When that happens, they shut down, so they don't send any power back to the grid to protect the line workers. And my brother's grateful for that. But when I could see that we were generating more power than we were actually using, that's when we turned on the AC, so it would cool at least one section of the rooms down, so we had a place to hide from the heat, right? So even with generation close to the source, we're never going to not need the grid. So one of the things that has to happen is there's got to be some sort of understanding that we're all in it together. Big utility people and individual homeowners, and I don't see that happening right now. It seems more like we're fussing.
Well, we'll get to work on that. I have just a couple of questions and thoughts, I suppose. Thinking back all the way to the start of this line of thinking with the question from the audience about the sort of importance of financial incentives. I'm interested to hear Carl's input as somebody with local solar who's done this sort of larger cost benefit analysis. If you could talk a little bit about the role of financial incentives and potentially the role they could continue to play, what role you think they should play. And then, yeah, I'll save the discussion, but so many of the things that you're saying, Janelle, about whether it's the utility company doesn't have time to worry about whether your fridge is on, or that we, can't be relying on power from too far away. Something, Carl, you said a few times during your presentation was right-sizing the grid and building the grid that we need. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that and sort of just sort of summarizing, I suppose, painting this vision of what you mean by right-sizing the grid.
So the modeling we did, because it was done completely objectively with a model, right, that just has to solve, how do I meet the next unit of electricity demand at the lowest cost? Most of our modeling, the sort of what's the aha thing in the modeling was that rather than being limited to just the yesterday's solutions, the model is new and more powerful and can choose from options that are big and small, close and far, and using that kind of systems thinking can figure out if it's really cheap, but it comes from 100 miles away, what does it cost to move that electricity here? So you can really do a fair comparison between making the electricity on your rooftop or in your neighborhood with a community solar installation versus making it less expensively, no doubt about it, making it less expensively a long ways away, like say, like half the things we buy in China, but then it has to be shipped and it has to be shipped to you over those brittle transmission lines. So when the model can do that kind of analysis, it reveals the economic efficiency of resources that are sized to match the changes in our load. Today, most power plants are built in the hundreds, even thousands of megawatts. And our household load is 5 to 10 kilowatts. So more than 1,000 times smaller than what we're building in our power plants. And it's simply the economics of being thirsty and only having a fire hose to drink from. There's gonna be some spillage, right? And that spillage makes money for utilities because waste is profit, the way utilities make money today, but it's money that we all have to pay. That's where incentives come in. The biggest problem we have with approaching our energy solutions is that for most of us all our lives, the only solution was the utility scale solution. The only models were utility scale models. The only political contributions were from utility scale businesses. And even better, more economic solutions can't break through unless you have somebody like Janelle who gets really smart about it and makes a commitment and stays at it for a long period of time. We've known that, so we make uneconomic decisions every day in our lives simply because we've always been making uneconomic decisions. And as Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera, said, sometimes to have a new idea, you have to stop having an old idea. Our modeling tries to let us stop having the old idea, but it's become abundantly clear that there is still a gap between people doing what's best and people doing what they've always done. In efficiency, we call it the efficiency gap. We know that every light bulb in your house should today be an LED light bulb. And 10 years ago, it should have been a CFL. And you have to go back 20 or 30 years to get to the time when an incandescent light bulb was a smart idea. But there's still a lot of incandescent light bulbs, even in the South, that that use 75% or more of the electricity, 90% of the electricity they use comes out as heat that we then have to air condition. And people still buy them. I see them at the Home Depot, right? They still go to those incandescent light bulbs. That efficiency gap has to be overcome with information, with policy preferences like goals, and with, sorry to say it, upfront cash. People need a financial signal. You need a sign that I can read that says 50% off or coupon or rebate or something. And the good news about our analysis, and I'll stop talking, is that we figured out that just to 2030, you got $109 billion to play with to make that change happen. You could use half of that and distribute $50 billion in savings, in incentives for distributed solar and distributed storage, and we'd still be $59 billion ahead. And that's what's amazing about finally painting that picture, doing that analysis, realizing the potential of those savings. Now we just have to get our policymakers to drink the water we've set in front of them, to eat the banquet we've placed before them, the banquet of lower cost to live in our country.
Yeah, I'll say one of the things like light bulbs. energy efficient light bulbs ain't cheap. And we have a lot of people who live very close to the edge here in New Orleans and Louisiana in the South. And so when you need light and you don't have a lot of money and you look at a $30 or $20 light bulb versus a $5 light bulb, guess which one they're gonna be forced to buy? It's exactly the same problem as putting the panels on your roof or adding storage, right? What can I really afford to do? And without policy changes, without long-term goals for the whole country being out there so we can shoot for them, the individual is going to have to work really hard and be crazy committed like I am in order to get to a place where I can say, you know, my 36 solar panels on my roof provide maybe half of what I actually need, and therefore reduce my costs by half. But without the tax incentives that I was able to have to put the panels up, there's nobody that I know that can afford to do that today. I mean, well, that's not true. I do know some people, but it's very, very few. It's not your average vote.
Well, and here's the real thing, that even with those tax incentives, society still gets more benefit from you putting in that system than the tax incentives cost. We know how to do benefit cost analysis, and all the objective benefit cost analysis, like the modeling we've done, but all the way down to like value of solar studies, tell us that we've got that headroom to spend a little money on incentives in order to make the 30, 40-year stream of benefits from that solar system or from that battery system pay off for everybody. And again, I'll go back to one of my first points here is storage. It depends on what you fill it with. It has to be filled with clean distributed solar or clean solar anyway, right? Because filling it up with coal isn't the answer. Filling it up with natural gas isn't the answer. The answer, and filling it up with, quote, renewable natural gas, what we should be filling it up with wind and sunlight, renewable resources. But together, that 1-2 punch generates those savings. So let's have incentives. We provide incentives for people to live in houses. We provide incentives for people to buy cars. Heck, during the last recession, you could buy a Suburban and write it off in a year. That's the kind of incentives we produce for the car industry. So these incentives are not about selfishness. This is not about, making Janelle rich. It's about getting her to do something that she had the cash to do, something that would benefit all of us, even if the panels are sitting on her own roof. And by the way, she took care of the financing. She takes care of the insurance. She does the maintenance. If it's a utility system, we all have to pay for that. She's a volunteer in a lot of ways. And all it took was a cost-effective incentive to make that happen.
Right, that's right. Well, and financial capacity, right? I had to have the cost there, but in order to put my panels on my roof, I refinanced my house.
Yeah.
Okay. Now interest rates were going down and fooling, but I refinanced my house, pulled enough money out, managed to make all of that work. It still takes more than people think, which is why I think pushing for, I read that there's something in a bill that was getting pushed around in Congress that said the solar, if you did solar, which included storage, that you'd get 100% of it back. That's what you need. If you really want to claw away at the power of the utility companies in oil and gas, you have to put the capacity to add clean energy in the hands of individuals. Because if it's not in the hands of individuals, too much of the rest of the pressures that we have as participating citizens in capitalism are going to make it difficult for them to make that leap.
And we got to have more than a half a century's worth of energy experience, maybe even a century's worth of energy experience just on this webinar. But imagine how much harder it is for people who are, their lives are full just trying to make it. They're at survival levels of use of energy and other resources. The last thing they have time to do is changing the way their electricity is made. The lesson is we have to work even harder to make sure that these clean energy solutions also address energy justice. Because if we leave them out, one of the political realities here is that the bad guys, if you will, will try to divide us. They'll do like in California, they'll get Hispanic and Black business groups to say that we don't support rooftop solar because it only is a cost for low income people, only a cost for our constituents. We have to make sure that this revolution in the way we make and use and store energy works for everyone, so that it's not politically vulnerable or just unjust.
I want to maybe wrap things up with, there's another question from the chat about, we talked about the role of states making these commitments. We've talked about meeting President Biden's energy goals by 2030 and beyond. Somebody asked, and Janelle, it sounds like you have some experience getting into this at the city level, but what is the role of cities and actually helping us get there? Because we've talked so much about right sizing the grid and how this is coming down to individuals. What can city officials do?
City officials can set the goals. New Orleans has set a goal to be clean energy by, I don't know, X date, right? So they can set the goal. And depending on how the public utilities are regulated, New Orleans is we're lucky, we get to regulate our own utility for us, for Orleans Parish, for the city of New Orleans only, we're lucky we get to do that. So I don't know how cities can influence the regulation at state levels, other than you have to send city delegations to your state legislator to say, we've got a goal, this is what we want, how the heck are you going to help us get there?
Yeah, but I mean, in the utility business, cities is where the customers are, right? We know, because we've seen rural areas get kind of overlooked. The whole reason we have a cooperative industry, a cooperative form of electricity provision in a lot of places, because the investor-owned utilities didn't find it financially attractive to serve when there was only 1 meter per mile, right? They just wanted the dense urban places. So they're making their money there, right? And that's political power that we have, and it's economic power that we have. It's also true that we can change the way mayors think and city councils think faster and easier than we can change a governor, and God knows the US Senate, right? So when those people reach the decision and make those goals, we can do that. I lived in Austin, Texas. I ran distributed energies for the city of Austin. And I can tell you that when there's a very good chance that a city council member or the mayor will be walking into your office, you learn accountability. You learn to meet those goals. So New Orleans, working with the Energy Future Coalition of New Orleans, we got the city to adopt the only renewable portfolio standard in the Southeast. That's an amazing amount you couldn't get that done in the state of Louisiana. You couldn't get that done in Southern Company's territory. You couldn't get it done almost anywhere else in energy service territory, but you can work it a city at a time. And so I think they're critical to that. I think we need to expect it of them. And then I'll give you just one last really quick answer. The best and easiest thing that every city council or mayor, depending on the form of government of the city, could do is just come up with a simple rule. I stole this from somebody in Kansas City, so thank you, Missouri. That every time they consider a decision that's more than $50,000 or $10,000 or some number, pick a number, the staff of the city has to provide the answer to one question. How will this impact our sustainability? Just not saying change anything, just start asking the question and get an answer and think about, is this putting us in the right direction or is it pointing us in the wrong direction? Because we're spending taxpayer money on it. So that's the easiest way to start. But the best thing to do, as Janelle said, adopt a goal. When people start saying things, politicians especially tend to try to do things. And that's what we need to make them do.
I was just going to add, I know that we're coming up on time. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things that both Carl and Janelle just said. In Missouri, I'm sure is very much like Louisiana, but we do have our progressive, or like our more active cities that have put forward goals. We have 100% renewable goal in Kansas City. And so, like Carl said, cities are the biggest customers to electric companies, and there are contracts between, can't state this for every system, every city or whatnot, but at least in Kansas City, there's a contract that's written up between the city and the utility companies. And so if you talk to your city councilors, that, yeah, they are a lot easier to get in contact with, you know, they can start to think about these contracts that we have signed with utility companies to push the utility companies to provide renewable energy to, you know, the area, the metropolitan areas. So I just wanted to add that as well, because coming from a red state, sometimes it's really hard to pass things at the state level.
All right, I'm gonna cut us off there. We are right at time here at 3:30. Thank you so much, Janelle, Bridget, and Carl for being here for such an important discussion. Thanks to everybody who joined us here on Zoom, to everybody on Facebook Live. This will be recorded and also posted on Facebook Live. So if there's something that you heard here today that you want to share with a friend, be sure to do that after the webinar. And with that, I will say goodbye for the afternoon.
Thank you. Bye now.